Face disfigured by ulcers, fever, pain. It is everywhere. Wild terror in your eyes. No one knows whether you die or live. Most likely there is no escape. Smallpox, one of the most dangerous infectious diseases. Smallpox, along with plague and cholera, claimed the lives of tens of millions of people and terrorized human civilization for centuries. While other large-scale epidemics were quick to spread and disappear, smallpox harvested its victims for years, becoming almost the leading cause of death among children and adults alike. The victory over smallpox was the most famous example of the success of mass vaccination and international efforts to eradicate dangerous viruses. Today, I will talk about the emergence, rise, and fall of one of the most terrible diseases in the history of mankind. Smallpox, in Latin variola vera, is a disease caused by two types of viruses, variola major and variola minor. The former causes the most severe symptoms and often results in death. The mortality rate from variola major reaches 30%, that is, every third patient dies. The second type of smallpox, variola minor, is less dangerous. The lethality of outcomes is 1 to 3% and is estimated to kill about 1 person in 100. There is also natural smallpox, which develops in 90% of cases, kills about a third of those infected, and hemorrhagic or malignant smallpox, which ends in death almost without exception. With hemorrhagic smallpox, extensive bleeding occurs in the skin, digestive organs, and mucous membranes. Due to hemorrhages, the skin acquired a black color, which is why the disease was nicknamed black smallpox. It all starts like a common cold or flu. The temperature rises to 38 degrees, muscle pain occurs, a person feels fatigue, general discomfort, and headache. Characteristic signs are intoxication, chills, and fever. Symptoms appear 12 days after infection. In 2 to 3 days, the temperature subsides and a rash appears, first on the face, arms, and forearms, and later on the trunk. Ulcers appear, follicles on the skin that affect the mucous membranes of the oral cavity, the skin of the forehead, and spread throughout the body. After that, the disease can go in different ways, including turning into the most deadly forms. Even after recovery, scars from ulcers remain for life, and in some cases, a person goes blind. Natural smallpox is airborne and less likely transmitted by direct contact. Contaminated clothing, items, or bed linen can also be a source of transmission. Natural smallpox is most contagious during the first 7 to 10 days after the first signs of rashes appear on the skin or mucous tissues. In the entire history of smallpox existence, there were no specific medications against smallpox, and a third of the patients just died. Therefore, physicians could only deal with the symptoms, that is, break the fever or give the patient painkillers. Smallpox is a terrible and merciless disease for which there is no cure, and the probability of infection is extremely high. This infection of the millennium raged in different countries and on different continents, wiping out entire nations. It spared no one, regardless of race, nationality, age, or social class. Both peasants and kings were massively ill. Entire families of poor people and imperial dynasties died. For centuries, people have been horrified and felt powerless in the face of this disaster. Unable to save themselves or cope with this monstrous disease, they were inclined to attribute a supernatural, divine importance to it. Some people believed in the existence of separate deities who brought this dangerous disease to people. Among the African people of the Yoruba, for example, it was the god Sopona. In India, it was Mariotale, presented by a girl in red clothes. The people of India believed that this was a young woman in a very explosive mood. According to Indian legend, she got angry with her father and threw a golden necklace in his face, which left him with wounds there. People tried to appease her by making sacrifices, and when, as believed, Mariotale came to the house and moved into someone's body, she was called Smallpox, the respected guest. The patient was dressed in red to lure her out. Time passed, and medieval physicians also believed in ancient legends, dressing smallpox patients in red clothes. The timing of the emergence of the variola virus is still unknown. One of the versions says that smallpox viruses evolved from an African rodent virus 68,000 to 16,000 years ago. According to another version, they arose only 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Most often camels are considered the source of this dangerous disease. It was these animals that most likely started to carry the virus, which mutated and began to infect the human body. Due to the genetic similarity of camelpox and smallpox, it is assumed that the smallpox virus passed to humans from camels. One of the earliest pieces of evidence of smallpox was obtained from the examination of Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V mummy, with traces of smallpox on his face. He died in the 12th century BC. Egyptian traders probably brought smallpox to India in the first millennium BC, where the disease remained a region-specific one for several centuries before reaching China and Japan. Compared to other ancient infections, the history of smallpox spread across the planet is not so clear. In the past, it could easily be confused with other diseases such as chickenpox or measles. It is not known exactly when smallpox arrived in Southwest Asia and Europe. Although some experts suggest that the plague of Athens that broke out in Greece in 5th century BC was actually a smallpox epidemic, most scholars dispute this view. Mentions of a disease similar to smallpox are found in the works of Hippocrates and Galen. Among the Arabs, according to the testimony of the Arab physician Aaron, who lived in the 7th century, smallpox has been known since ancient times. Avicenna was the first to describe smallpox as a contagious disease. In the 2nd century AD, a disease broke out in the Roman Empire that claimed the lives of 5 million people. Scientists speculate that the Antonine Plague pandemic was caused by smallpox, although the true cause of the epidemic remains unknown. Other experts object to the course of the disease described by the ancient Roman physician Galen looks like smallpox. The first reliable evidence of the disease comes from the Persian polymath Abu Bakr Muhammad al-Razi, who made the most accurate description of smallpox and distinguished it from measles and chickenpox. In the 6th century, smallpox was already bossing around in Byzantium, having been brought from Africa under Justinian I. Muslim Arabs, having begun conquests, spread smallpox from Spain to India in the 7th to 8th centuries. History witnessed the appearance of smallpox in Syria, Palestine, and Persia in the 7th century, in Sicily, Italy, Spain, and France in the next 8th century. Since the 6th century, smallpox has appeared under the Latin name variola, which has survived to this day, first used by Bishop Marius of Avanches in the year 570. Since that time, smallpox, under its irreplaceable name, claimed many lives in Europe every year. Among the Normans, during their invasion of Paris in 1846, it spread to terrifying proportions. The confidant of King Charles the Bald, Cabot, also fell ill. The king, out of fear that the infection would reach himself and his court, ordered to kill all those infected, as well as those attending the sick. However, the number of patients was so huge that it was impossible to carry out this order. Queen Ostrigild of Burgundy, dying of smallpox and feeling helpless, asked her husband as a final favor to execute both of her physicians if they failed to save her. King Guntram complied with her request and ordered the learned physicians Nicholas and Donatus to be cut with swords. The spells, prayers, and talismans invented against smallpox certainly did nothing to alleviate smallpox, nor did the treatment methods of the time, such as dressing the sick person in red clothing to lure smallpox out. The spread of the disease had reached such a degree that it was rare to find a person who had never had smallpox. Therefore, in the Middle Ages, the Germans developed a saying, "Von Pocken unlebeben nur wenige frei." Few people can escape smallpox and love. Although there were several outbreaks of smallpox in medieval Europe, they did not develop into a large-scale epidemic until the era of the Crusades began. Population growth and the movement of large masses of people helped smallpox to spread throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. In Europe, the death rate was as high as 30%. The conquistadors unintentionally brought the disease to the New World, where it turned into a kind of biological weapon that destroyed the civilization of the Aztecs and Incas. Native Americans were completely defenseless against diseases that they had never encountered before. At the beginning of the 16th century, it claimed the lives of millions of Indians, and entire tribes perished. For example, the population of the Taino people was more than 1 million people, and after 20 years, there were only 500 people left. An English colony founded in the middle of the 17th century on the east coast of North America also caused outbreaks of smallpox among the North American Indians. Mortality reached 80 to 90%. Since the 15th century, Europe has already been an entire smallpox hospital. So physicians, for example Mercuriale, began to assert that every person should fall ill with smallpox at least once in a lifetime. The English physician Kilway, in his treatise on smallpox, considered it superfluous to go into a detailed description of this disease, since it is well known to almost everyone. In the 15th century, terrible smallpox epidemics tormented France, about which Bellonius wrote, "Such mortality has not happened within the memory of people. Almost everyone who was stricken with smallpox died." The famous English historian Thomas Macaulay, speaking of the death of Queen Mary, who died of smallpox, notes that this disease was one of the most terrible accomplices of death at that time. Twice in living memory, while smallpox dwelt relentlessly between us, filling the cemeteries with the dead, tormenting with constant fear all those who had not yet been ill with it, leaving ugly signs on the faces of the people whose lives it spared, like the stigma of its power, making the child unrecognizable for his own mother, turning the beautiful bride into an object of disgust in the eyes of the groom. The smallpox had no mercy to anyone, neither the nobility nor the mob. It spread its destructive power as often in the huts of the poor as in the homes of the rich. It penetrated into the palaces of sovereigns, and more than once threatened European dynasties. Since the 17th century, a lot of factual data on smallpox was accumulated and recorded by contemporaries. Since there was no country in the Old and New Worlds where smallpox would not run riot, a terrible picture of the extermination and disfigurement of mankind is obtained. In many states, statistical data on mortality from smallpox have been preserved. Thus, in the British Museum, there is information about the huge mortality in London in the 17th century. The terrible epidemic continued into the next century. The total number of all deaths from smallpox was determined in Prussia by the beginning of the 19th century at 40,000 people annually. Only in 1796 in Germany, 70,000 inhabitants died from this disease. In general, it was estimated that more than 1.5 million people died of smallpox every year in Europe. In 18th century France, when the police searched for a person, it was stated as a special sign, "No sign of smallpox." The widespread of smallpox was one of the reasons for the excessive use of cosmetics. A thick layer of white paint and rouge applied to the face made it possible not only to give the skin the desired shade, but also to mask smallpox scars. In May 1767, smallpox again hit Vienna. This terrible disease did not bypass the imperial court, granting no quarter to the whole dynasty. This was not the first case of smallpox at the Hofburg. Emperor Joseph I had already died from it, and as a result, his younger brother, the father of Maria Theresa, inherited the throne. Further on, Maria Theresa played a very important role in the fight against smallpox epidemics and in the promotion of the original, if not ideal, vaccination against this deadly disease. Smallpox claimed the life of the 1-year-old daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, and later 2 more of Her Majesty's children died from this disease. Isabella, the daughter-in-law of Emperor Joseph, also died of smallpox. She fell ill with this terrible disease during pregnancy. While infected, 21-year-old Isabella gave birth to a very preterm baby girl who died immediately. A few days later, the young mother also went on prolonged rest. The widower, Archduke Joseph, survived smallpox. Other family members managed to be isolated. At that time, it was already known that this extremely contagious disease is airborne. Today, it is difficult for us to imagine the torment experienced by smallpox patients. It all started with the appearance of red spots all over the body. Then they turned into purulent pustules that burst and shrivel into a brown crust, causing unbearable itching, headache, muscle aches. The disease spread to the internal organs, causing internal bleeding. Physicians were powerless against this terrible disease. Their methods of therapy were limited to bloodletting, which did not help, but, on the contrary, brought the death of the unfortunate patients closer. They lay on dirty, smelly bed linen, which relatives did not dare to change for fear of becoming infected. Smallpox went away, but every now and then it came back. It had no mercy, either on the poor or on the rich. People died by thousands, and the survivors had to live until the last days with the consequences: pockmarks, scars, deafness, blindness. At the end of the 18th century, smallpox returned to Vienna and to the Habsburg family. When the second wife of Archduke Joseph died of smallpox, Maria Theresa came to say goodbye to her daughter-in-law and became infected herself. The 50-year-old empress was having a hard time with her illness, and physicians were preparing for a worse outcome. The news of the terminal state of Maria Theresa, beloved by the people, quickly spread throughout Vienna. A crowd stood at the Hofburg for days, praying to the Lord for the recovery of Her Majesty. In all Viennese churches, there were constant masses for her health. Maria Theresa had already received the dying anointing and made her confession, but miraculously survived. She was very upset about the illness consequences and ordered to veil all the mirrors in the Hofburg so as not to see the ugly scars on her face. Several months passed. It seemed that the terrible disease had left Hofburg. The court began to prepare for a joyful event: the upcoming wedding of 16-year-old Archduchess Maria Josepha with the Neapolitan King Ferdinand. They arranged balls, theatrical performances, and hunting excursions. And suddenly the young bride had symptoms of smallpox. Maria Theresa, immune to this disease after her illness, did not leave her daughter's bed. After 11 days, the girl was dead. Archduchess Maria Josepha died without becoming Queen of Naples. Leopold Mozart and his talented infants prodigies, 11-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus and 16-year-old Nannerl, who arrived at the highest wedding in Vienna, also fell ill with this ailment. The composer Haydn fell ill with smallpox too, as well as Goethe and Beethoven. Imagine that many celebrities whom we know by embellished portraits had their faces disfigured by smallpox. The disease was already looking for a new victim among the Habsburgs, and found it, despite all the measures taken by the court physicians to isolate other family members. In the midst of mourning for the deceased must-have-been bride, her older sister, 24-year-old Archduchess Maria Elizabeth, developed familiar alarming symptoms: chills, fever, headache, nausea, convulsions. The whole body was covered with red spots, then follicles and purulent pustules. Maria Elizabeth survived, but the entire world collapsed for her overnight. Her own beauty was her cult and main asset, and now the once beautiful face with smooth white skin was covered with ruts and craters. However, oddly enough, the mother still tried to marry her daughter. Although these ambitious plans did not come true, the widowed French king Louis XV, a connoisseur of female beauty, did not want to marry pockmarked. It didn't work out with the Spanish monarch Charles III either. Maria Elizabeth remained unmarried and lived to be 65 years old. So, smallpox took away 4 children of Maria Theresa. The other 2 survived after the disease. The empress called the disease the sworn enemy of the Habsburgs. She decided to take up arms against it for the sake of her surviving children and grandchildren. European monarchs were the driving force behind the development of smallpox vaccination. At that time, the so-called variolation, the predecessor of the future smallpox vaccine, had been known for several decades. In 1718, it was brought to Europe from Turkey by Lady Montagu, the wife of the English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. She variolated her children in Constantinople. In the East, this has been a practice since the Middle Ages. The meaning behind it was that, as a preventive measure, pus from a mature pustule of a patient with natural smallpox was inoculated into a person, which most of all led to the disease in a mild form. In England, after experiments on criminals and children from church orphanages, smallpox was inoculated into the family of British King George I. In the first 8 years in England, smallpox was inoculated to 845 people, of whom 17 could not bear it and died. That is, variolation resulted in 2% mortality. Since natural smallpox resulted in 10 to 20 times more deaths, variolation was at first very popular. However, it not only led to the death of those inoculated against smallpox from time to time, but often caused epidemics itself. It did not always protect those who underwent vaccination from subsequent infection with smallpox. This was partly due to the fact that unqualified physicians and charlatans were often directly involved in vaccinations. Angelo Gatti published a book on the correct variolation, indicating that inoculation should be done with a gentle superficial injection, and by no means deep cuts or, even worse, with the help of setons to which sponges and coins moistened with smallpox pus were applied. His work was very popular, but could not improve things. Variolation was banned in France by an Act of Parliament in 1762, but lasted in England until 1840. Despite this, physician Watson, having no safe smallpox vaccine, applied it later on a ship at sea when an epidemic broke out among the sailors, and all 363 vaccinated survived, while 9 out of 12 smallpox patients died. After Lady Montagu managed to get Caroline, Princess of Wales and England, interested, English princes and princesses were successfully inoculated, and under the auspices of the royal family, this method gradually spread among the population. However, we cannot say that people ran in droves for variolation, because it had its disadvantages. A person became contagious to the rest, and this resulted in outbreaks of new smallpox epidemics. Besides, mortality after variolation was considerable, about 2 to 3%, although without variolation, actually a third of the sick died. It must be said that European monarchs were the driving force in the development of smallpox vaccination. After all, this terrible disease also did not have mercy on them, and could leave the royal dynasties without heirs. For example, in the Lorraine family, relatives of Maria Theresa, smallpox claimed 10 out of 14 children. In Austria, physicians also experimented in this direction. Same as everywhere, they were practicing on children from orphanages and prisoners in prisons. But the British were ahead. In 1768, Maria Theresa invited English smallpox physicians to Vienna. She was advised to do this by her cousin Anthony of Saxony, who in turn was convinced of the need for vaccinations by the Prussian King Friedrich. Friedrich himself had been ill with smallpox as a child. His beloved nephew died from this ailment. The youngest sons of Maria Theresa, as well as the youngest daughter, Maria Antonia, the future Marie Antoinette, received variolation vaccinations. And while the Austrian Empress was alive, she made sure that all her grandchildren were also vaccinated. But her 7-month-old grandson Albrecht and 4-year-old great-granddaughter Caroline Louise did not survive the variolation and died, presumably from its effects. At the same time, by order of Maria Theresa, a vaccination center was created in Vienna, on the Rennweg, where the population could receive a free smallpox vaccine. Then similar points were opened in other regions of the country. At the same time in France, they have not yet thought about vaccinations. Apparently, they forgot about the smallpox epidemic at the end of the 17th century, when all the inhabitants of the Versailles fled from the palace, away from this pestilence. Or about the epidemic of the early 18th century, when smallpox wiped out almost all of the legitimate heirs of the Sun King, Louis XIV. The old monarch himself did not become infected, as he already had immunity against smallpox after being ill as a child. The disease has not spared the 64-year-old Louis XV, who had disdained the pockmarked Viennese bride a few years before. Smallpox overtook him too. His illness was especially severe. The Duc de Croix, who saw the king before his death, recalled in terror. The head and shoulder area were entirely covered with crust and looked like a bronze mask, like a motionless bust with an open mouth. The head was like that of a Moor, copper-colored, huge, covered in purulent scabs. Contrary to the centuries-old traditions of the French court, the body of the late monarch was not subject to autopsy and embalming, so the heart was not buried separately. The ashes of Louis XV were placed in a lead coffin and sprinkled with quicklime. They decided not to exhibit the coffin for a solemn farewell either in Versailles or in the Louvre in Paris. Without the usual ceremonies, by the light of torches, the ashes of the emperor were taken to the tomb of the French kings of Saint Denis and quickly buried. Such a terrible death of the monarch, who until recently was a healthy and strong man, caused a strong shock at the court. Therefore, a few weeks later, the new King Louis XVI and his two younger brothers, who would also become French kings in turn, underwent variolation, and the young Queen Marie Antoinette did not need immunity. She received it as a child in Vienna. The Bavarian Prince Maximilian III Joseph, who vigorously promoted variolation among his subjects but rejected it for himself, also died of smallpox. By the middle of the 18th century, smallpox had become the main endemic disease throughout the world, except in Australia and small islands. The widespread use of variolation in some countries has somewhat reduced the impact of smallpox, but there has been no real decrease in incidence. Outbreaks occurred until vaccination became common practice towards the end of the 19th century. A similar situation occurred in Australia in the 18th to 19th centuries, when smallpox became the main cause of death among the local indigenous people. Thus, smallpox turned from an endemic disease into a global threat, and remained like that until the end of the first half of the 20th century. Epidemics, covering entire countries, recurred every decade and became especially devastating during the years of war. 400,000 Europeans became their victims annually, and children were the most vulnerable social group. There have been attempts in history to use the smallpox virus as a biological weapon. As long as in the 15th century, Cortés used blackpox in the fight against the capture of Mexico. In the 18th century, it was used by British troops in America against the Indians. In 1763, during the siege of Fort Pitt, British officers attempted to infect the Indians besieging the fort with smallpox by giving them smallpox blankets. As a result, an epidemic of smallpox broke out among the American Indians, which claimed the lives of more than half of the local population. Smallpox was also used for military purposes during the American invasion of Canada in 1776. The first attempts to overcome smallpox were made in China, India, and other parts of Asia long before the official invention of vaccination. They deliberately tried to infect people with a small dose of the virus so that the patient would more easily endure the disease. To do this, they took pus from a smallpox vesicle and injected it into a healthy person. Somewhere it was done through the nose, somewhere with a needle, piercing the skin in different places. Later, they began to pass a thread soaked in pus under the skin. Mortality during variolation was approximately 2%, but people died many times more often from smallpox itself, so the method of variolation was still used. The history of modern smallpox vaccination dates back to 1796, when Edward Jenner conducted his famous experiment. Edward Jenner is an English physician and scientist who made one of the most important discoveries for the preservation of mankind, having invented a counteraction to serious infectious diseases. Guess what we're talking about? Of course, about the vaccine. It was he who invented it in the 18th century. Interestingly, the term vaccination comes from the Latin vaccina, which means cowpox. As early as 1765, physicians Sutton and Fuster reported to the Medical Society of London that smallpox in dairy cows, if caught by humans, protects them from natural human smallpox. The London Medical Society did not agree with them, treating their observation as a mere accident worthy of no further investigation. However, in 1774, the English farmer Benjamin Jesty successfully inoculated his family with cowpox, and the German teacher Peter Plett did the same in 1791. Dr. Edward Jenner also observed that milkmaids who contracted cowpox did not usually get smallpox during outbreaks. He suggested that cowpox, on the one hand, was different enough from smallpox, and that is why it caused only relatively mild symptoms in humans, but, on the other hand, was similar enough to this disease to protect against it. On May 14, 1796, Jenner removed pus from the cowpox follicle of a sick milkmaid and then rubbed it into the scratches on the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. About a month later, Jenner tried to inoculate him with smallpox, but nothing worked, and it did not take root. Jenner realized that the cowpox virus could be used as a vaccination to replace the more dangerous method of variolation, in which pus from the pustules of a smallpox patient was inoculated into a healthy person. Mortality with variolation reached 2%, which is still much less than the mortality from smallpox itself. But variolation, among other things, had one rather serious drawback. It could cause outbreaks of smallpox itself. Additional experiments with cowpox by Dr. Jenner also proved successful, after which the scientists published the results and expressed hope that vaccination would eliminate the terrible disease once and for all. So, due to a dangerous but successful experiment, Dr. Jenner managed to create the world's first vaccine, whose effectiveness was confirmed. At first, other scientists were skeptical and cautious about Jenner's findings, recommending that he conduct more thorough research. Some of Jenner's conclusions seemed incorrect or erroneous to them. Besides, sometimes vaccination turns out useless or caused severe side effects. The absence of the cowpox pathogen in the vaccine, the presence of other viruses, or bacterial contamination could be the reason for such cases. Compliance with the rules during the vaccine preparation has reduced the mortality from side effects to almost zero. Later, there was no doubt about the effectiveness of Jenner's method, and vaccination became widespread, having replaced variolation. However, there were people who did not want to be inoculated with Jenner's vaccine. In their opinion, the very idea of infecting a person with an animal disease was unnatural. Cartoonists drew pictures of small cows growing on the vaccination sites. Some remained variolation supporters out of fear of change. Active opposition arose in response to the introduction by some countries of mandatory vaccination among children, as a result of which vaccination in the USA, England, and other European countries became voluntary. At first, vaccination was not welcomed, but as early as the beginning of the 19th century, it became mandatory in many areas of Europe. In 1800, vaccination was made compulsory in the English Army and Navy. During these years, it spread to the English colonies, North America, and further into Europe. In 1803, the Spanish king, convinced of the benefits of vaccination, ordered his personal physician, Francis Xavier de Balmas, to deliver the vaccine to Spanish possessions in the Americas. To keep it usable during its journey, a physician took 22 boys from orphanages in Spain, aged 3 to 9, who had not previously had cowpox or smallpox. While moving across the Atlantic Ocean, de Balmas vaccinated orphans in a living chain. 2 children were inoculated before leaving, and when cowpox pustules appeared on their arms, the discharge from those ulcers was used to vaccinate the next 2 children. In 1807, Bavaria became the first country to make smallpox vaccination compulsory for the population. In the first years after the invention of vaccination, it was carried out from hand to hand. Cowpox was inoculated to one person, then, after a few days, the discharge was removed from the vaccination site and used as material for the next vaccination. This method, humanized lymph vaccination, required damage to the pockmark on the arm of the vaccination material during its removal, which could cause inflammation at the vaccination site and slow down the healing of the wound. Besides, pathogens of various diseases, including syphilis and erysipelas, could be transmitted along with cowpox. All this taken together prompted him to take the animal lymph. It turned out that cowpox in calves, which were originally vaccinated with native cowpox, is absolutely safe. Calfpox, taken from calves, is inoculated in humans, and the same calfpox is vaccinated in other calves. Since the use of calfpox since the 1860s, smallpox vaccination has become available to the masses because it has become possible to obtain the necessary smallpox material in any quantity very cheaply and to distribute smallpox without any resistance among the people who were instinctively disgusted with taking smallpox and hand-to-hand inoculation. The simplest way to prepare the vaccine was to scrape pustules from calves and rub them with glycerin, pox detritus. As early as the 20th century, a freeze-dehydrated vaccine was suggested. Such a vaccine was resistant to the temperature factor, which was extremely important for the countries of tropical Africa, Asia, South America, where the liquid preparation was quickly inactivated. Improved vaccines have led to significant reductions in incidence in Europe and North America. In 1967, the WHO decided to carry out mass vaccination. The complete eradication of smallpox became possible in the early 20th century when international health organizations began to track outbreaks around the world and carry out mass vaccination with improved vaccines. The last outbreak of smallpox occurred in Somalia in October 1977, whereafter a special medical commission visited all countries where smallpox occurred, and in December 1979, the scientists concluded that smallpox had been completely eradicated. The discovery of the first vaccine and the development of new methods of vaccination made it possible to completely get rid of smallpox in the 20th century. Today, natural smallpox cannot manifest itself, since the very virus that causes it has been destroyed. The victory over smallpox was achieved thanks to the widespread use of vaccines against it in all countries of the world. Due to the disappearance of the disease in 1980, the World Health Organization recommended that vaccination against it should be stopped. However, the dangerous virus kept living in the laboratories, and some incidents of containment violations led to infections and even death. In 1978, British woman Janet Parker was diagnosed with natural smallpox. She was a medical photographer, had a good job at the University of Birmingham, and had a loving family. In 1978, Parker became mysteriously ill. For the British, this story has turned into a real investigation from detective novels. At that time, the disease was already considered extinct all over the world, but suddenly, smallpox was back in Britain's second-largest city. It was like a real apocalypse, because the whole world was sure that this terrible disease became history, and people can no longer be afraid of its return. It was not that easy. The disease did not disappear. It just waited in the weeds. In 1978, there was a biological incident in the UK, and the smallpox virus sample spread through the ventilation system of a university laboratory, infecting 2 people and killing another one. Yes, we're talking about Janet Parker, a medical photographer. After working in the laboratory, she suddenly fell ill. First, the physicians diagnosed her with chickenpox, and Janet's mother blew the whistle. After all, the follicles that appeared on her daughter's body did not look like an almost innocent disease that we associate with brilliant green at all. Therefore, Mrs. Parker was hospitalized. After that, the terrible word appeared in her medical record: smallpox. Janet Parker was diagnosed with smallpox. Those with whom the woman came into contact were vaccinated and sent to quarantine. In general, for a short time, physicians in Britain vaccinated approximately 500 people, every one who could communicate with Janet. Meanwhile, the woman felt worse. Almost complete blindness, kidney failure, pneumonia. It was difficult for her to speak and breathe. Within a month of being ill, the woman died. Smallpox claimed the last human life of the 20th century and has not returned to this day. Then, under the scrutiny of international media, the British began to investigate where the virus came from. But the culprit was never found. In the medical laboratory where Janet worked, smallpox spores were stored. Therefore, even after several years in court, 3 causes of infection were named: ventilation, contact with an infected person, or touching an infected object. However, there is still no exact answer to the question, how did Janet Parker get infected? Because of the heightened risk of the variola virus, In June 1999, the WHO recommended that all stocks of the virus held by all laboratories in the world be destroyed. However, due to the need for further study in the same year, the WHO decided to postpone the entire eradication of the virus and concentrate the remaining stocks in 2 laboratories. One of them is in Russia, and the other is in the USA. All countries reported their participation in this action. However, the subject of smallpox did not fall from the agenda. The incidents continued. In 2001, U.S. President George W. Bush ordered to inoculate all military personnel against smallpox after anthrax spores were sent out and smallpox was threatened as a bioweapon. In July 2014, 6 vials of the virus were found in a forgotten cardboard box in a warehouse on the Maryland Health Institute campus. In 2015, the tubes were destroyed under the supervision of the WHO representative. In November 2021, 15 dubious vials labeled variola and vaccine were discovered in a Merck lab while cleaning a freezer. This raised serious security concerns. The FBI and CDC are conducting a joint investigation into the origin and contents of these vials. Although the World Health Organization declared smallpox eliminated in 1980, the U.S. government believes that the smallpox pathogen can still be used as a biological weapon. So in July 2018, in accordance with the U.S. Department of Defense's Biological Threat Reduction Program, the U.S. FDA registered the first medication for the treatment of the disease. Research on medication effectiveness was conducted on animals. The result of the experiments showed that the animals treated with the medication lived longer than those individuals who were injected with a placebo. After that, the safety of this preparation was studied with the participation of 359 healthy volunteers, and the most common side effect of the drug was headache, nausea, and abdominal pain. Currently, in the event of a resurgence of this disease, antiviral medications can be used to treat it. To prevent secondary bacterial infection, antiseptic preparations can be applied to the affected skin areas. If there are bacterial complications, antibiotics with a wide spectrum may be prescribed to patients. Also, measures aimed at detoxifying the body can be carried out. These include the administration of crystalloid and colloidal solutions, and in some cases, ultrafiltration and plasmapheresis are performed. Several generations of smallpox vaccines have been developed in the world and are expected to be effective against the monkeypox disease, which has recently had an outbreak. Smallpox is the first of 2 infectious diseases, the other being rinderpest, to be eradicated by mass vaccination. The eradication of smallpox by vaccination is one of the strongest arguments in favor of vaccination. Sincerely yours, Dr. Popmed.